My name is Audrey Campbell. I'm 27 years old, and after 5 grueling years of building my app development company from a small startup in my garage to a thriving business generating 7-figure revenues, carefully saving every possible dollar to fund the wedding of my dreams, I discovered that my own family had completely emptied my $3 million wedding fund to pay off my Uncle George's catastrophic casino debts, with my mother Linda coldly informing me over coffee that I should just elope because weddings are overrated anyway, while my Uncle George sat at the same Sunday dinner table wearing a brand new $15,000 Rolex Submariner and bragging about his lucky streak at the poker tables. What they didn't know was that their breathtaking betrayal had just transformed me from the family's compliant ATM machine into someone who would expose their systematic financial abuse to the entire world, ultimately destroying George's reputation, landing Linda in prison, and teaching our extended family that enabling a gambling addict by stealing from responsible relatives creates consequences far more devastating than letting the addict face their own choices and learn from the natural results of their destructive behavior. I had always been what my family called the practical dreamer, someone who could envision ambitious goals while possessing the discipline and strategic thinking necessary to actually achieve them through methodical planning, consistent execution, and the kind of delayed gratification that allows you to sacrifice immediate pleasures for long-term objectives that seem impossible to most people. My journey as a tech entrepreneur began during my final year at Stanford University, when I identified a gap in the mobile productivity market and spent countless nights in the computer lab developing the first version of TaskFlow, a project management application that integrated artificial intelligence with intuitive user design to help small businesses and freelancers organize complex workflows without requiring expensive enterprise software or extensive technical training. The early years of building TaskFlow were characterized by the kind of financial sacrifice that most people my age couldn't comprehend or sustain. Living in a cramped studio apartment with a broken air conditioner, eating ramen noodles and peanut butter sandwiches for months at a time, driving a 15-year-old Honda Civic with over 200,000 miles that required constant repairs, and reinvesting every penny of early revenue back into product development, user acquisition, and the technical infrastructure necessary to scale a software platform from hundreds of users to hundreds of thousands, without compromising performance or security. But by the time I turned 25, TaskFlow had achieved the kind of breakthrough success that validates years of sacrifice and uncertainty. We had secured major enterprise clients, including 3 Fortune 500 companies. Our monthly recurring revenue exceeded $400,000, and industry analysts were predicting that our innovative approach to AI-assisted project management would capture significant market share from established competitors who had become complacent about user experience and technological innovation. The financial security that came with TaskFlow's success allowed me to begin planning for the personal milestones that I had postponed during the company's startup phase, including my engagement to Marcus Rivera, an environmental lawyer whom I had met through mutual friends and who shared my values about building a meaningful life through purposeful work that contributed positively to society. Marcus and I had discussed marriage extensively during our 3-year relationship, and we both wanted a wedding celebration that reflected our personalities, values, and appreciation for the friends and family members who had supported us through the challenges of building our respective careers. My vision for our wedding was admittedly elaborate, but deeply personal. A 3-day celebration in Napa Valley featuring a rehearsal dinner at a historic vineyard, a ceremony in a botanical garden overlooking rolling hills of wine country, and a reception with live music from the San Francisco Symphony String Quartet, gourmet dining prepared by a James Beard award-winning chef, and custom floral arrangements that would transform the venue into something resembling a fairy tale setting. The total cost would be approximately $1.3 million, an amount that seemed extravagant to some people, but represented less than 2 years of my company's profits, and would create the kind of magical experience that Marcus and I wanted to share with the 200 people who mattered most in our lives. More importantly, I had earned every dollar of that wedding fund through my own entrepreneurial success, technical innovation, and business acumen. It wasn't inherited wealth, family money, or financial support from anyone else. but rather the fruits of years of calculated risks, strategic decisions, and the kind of relentless work ethic that had transformed a college student's app idea into a multi-million-dollar company that employed 37 people and served clients across North America and Europe. The systematic saving process for my dream wedding had been as methodical and disciplined as building my business. I had opened a dedicated high-yield savings account specifically for wedding expenses, automatically transferred $25,000 per month from my business profits, and watched the balance grow from $0 to over $1. $3 million while maintaining detailed spreadsheets that tracked every deposit and calculated projections for venue costs, catering expenses, floral arrangements, photography, music, transportation, and all the other elements that would create our perfect celebration. But what I didn't understand was that my family had been watching my wedding fund grow with the kind of predatory attention that views other people's success as a resource to be exploited rather than an achievement to be celebrated, and that they had been making plans to access that money for purposes that had nothing to do with my wedding or my happiness. The Campbell family dynamics had always been complicated by the presence of my Uncle George, my father's younger brother, who had struggled with gambling addiction for over 2 decades, while consistently avoiding the kind of professional help or personal accountability that might have addressed his destructive behavior before it began affecting everyone around him. George Campbell was 48 years old, chronically unemployed despite having an engineering degree from UC Berkeley, and completely consumed by gambling activities that ranged from weekly poker games with friends to extended trips to Las Vegas casinos where he would lose thousands of dollars in single weekends while convincing himself that he was due for a big win that would solve all his financial problems and vindicate years of losses. The family's approach to George's gambling addiction was a textbook example of enabling behavior disguised as compassion and family loyalty, instead of requiring him to face natural consequences for his choices, seek professional treatment for his addiction, or develop alternative coping mechanisms for whatever psychological issues drove his compulsive behavior. They treated each financial crisis as an emergency that required immediate intervention from financially successful relatives who should sacrifice their own goals to prevent George from experiencing the discomfort of bankruptcy, creditor harassment, or social embarrassment. George is going through a rough patch, but he's family, and we need to stick together, my mother Linda would announce whenever George's latest gambling losses created urgent demands for cash infusions from relatives who had demonstrated financial responsibility and success. These rough patches occurred with predictable regularity. Every 3 to 6 months, George would exhaust his available credit, max out his credit cards, drain any savings he might have accumulated, and find himself facing either eviction from his apartment, repossession of his car, or aggressive collection efforts from creditors who were no longer willing to accept promises and payment plans from someone with a documented history of financial irresponsibility. The family meetings to discuss George's latest crisis followed the same pattern every time. George would appear appropriately remorseful and desperate, explaining that he had learned his lesson and just needed one final bailout to get back on his feet. Linda would advocate passionately for helping him while criticizing any family member who suggested that enabling his behavior was ultimately harmful, and successful relatives would be pressured to contribute specific amounts based on their perceived ability to pay, rather than their willingness to enable destructive behavior. My contributions to George's bailout fund over the years had totaled nearly $200,000, money that came directly from TaskFlow's profits and represented significant sacrifices in terms of business reinvestment, personal savings, and long-term financial planning. Each time I wrote a check to cover George's gambling debts, I told myself that this would be the final bailout, and that surely George would eventually recognize the toll his addiction was taking on everyone around him. But instead of gratitude or behavior change, George seemed to interpret each rescue as validation that his gambling was ultimately sustainable, because family resources would always be available to cover any losses that exceeded his ability to pay. The most frustrating aspect of the family's enabling behavior was their complete refusal to acknowledge that George's gambling was an addiction requiring professional treatment rather than a series of unlucky breaks that would eventually turn around if he just received enough financial support to continue playing. They spoke about his losses as if they were temporary setbacks rather than predictable consequences of compulsive behavior, and they treated his promises to be more careful or quit after one big win as if they were realistic commitments rather than the kinds of rationalizations that characterize addictive thinking. George just needs to catch a lucky streak to get even, and then he'll be able to stop gambling and focus on finding steady employment, Linda would say during family discussions about his latest financial crisis. This magical thinking ignored the fundamental nature of gambling addiction, which creates psychological dependency on the activity itself, regardless of whether the outcomes are positive or negative, and which typically escalates over time as tolerance builds and larger amounts of money are required to generate the same emotional higulation that initially made gambling appealing. Meanwhile, my own financial success was treated by the family as a resource that should be available for George's benefit, rather than as an achievement that deserved respect, protection, or recognition. When I mentioned my wedding planning or discussed business milestones, family conversations would quickly shift to George's needs, his latest gambling stories, or strategies for helping him recover from his most recent losses. My accomplishments were acknowledged politely but briefly, while George's problems received extensive analysis, emotional support, and collective problem-solving efforts that positioned him as the family member who deserved the most attention and assistance. The contrast was particularly stark during family gatherings, where I would share news about task flow's growth, new client acquisitions, or industry recognition we had received, only to watch family members' eyes glaze over with boredom before enthusiastically engaging with George's animated stories about poker tournaments, casino experiences, or his theories about systems that would eventually allow him to win consistently. My success was treated as expected and unremarkable, while George's gambling activities were discussed as if they were interesting hobbies rather than destructive behaviors that were consuming family resources and emotional energy. Have you ever realized that your family treats your success as an obligation to fund other people's mistakes, rather than as an achievement that deserves celebration and protection? That's exactly what I experienced during years of watching my hard-earned money disappear into George's gambling addiction, while my own dreams and goals were treated as optional luxuries that could be sacrificed whenever George needed another bailout. The systematic devaluation of my wedding plans had been subtle but consistent. Family members would make comments about how expensive my wedding was going to be, suggest that the money could be better used for other purposes, or imply that spending $1.3 million on a single day was somehow morally questionable, despite the fact that it represented my own earnings and would create meaningful memories for Marcus and me. These comments weren't presented as direct criticism, but rather as gentle suggestions that I should reconsider my priorities and perhaps scale back my plans to something more reasonable and practical. Weddings are really just parties, Linda would say whenever I discussed venue options or catering selections, and the most important thing is the marriage itself, not how much money you spend on one day. Some of the happiest couples I know had very simple ceremonies that cost almost nothing. The subtext of these conversations was always that my wedding fund represented excessive spending on frivolous luxuries, while George's gambling debts were legitimate emergencies that required family sacrifice and immediate intervention. The irony was that George's total gambling losses over the past 5 years exceeded $2 million, nearly twice what I was planning to spend on my wedding. But those losses were never characterized as excessive or frivolous spending. Instead, they were framed as unfortunate circumstances that required family support, while my wedding was presented as optional entertainment that could be eliminated if more pressing financial needs arose within the family structure. But what I didn't realize was that Linda's criticism of my wedding plans wasn't just disapproval of my spending choices. It was preparation for stealing my wedding fund to solve George's latest and most serious financial crisis, one that involved not just credit card debt or small-time creditors, but legitimate casino debts to organizations that employed collection methods significantly more aggressive than traditional lenders. The phone call that changed everything came on a Tuesday morning in April, exactly 3 weeks before my scheduled wedding date, while I was in my office reviewing final vendor confirmations and making last-minute adjustments to our guest seating arrangements. I had been looking forward to a day of pleasant wedding preparations when Linda called with what she described as urgent family business that required immediate discussion and couldn't be handled over the phone. "Audrey, I need you to come over to the house right now," Linda said, her voice carrying the kind of serious tone that I had learned to associate with George's financial crises. "There's been a development with George's situation, and we need to discuss how the family is going to handle it." I assumed that George had accumulated another round of gambling debts that would require the usual family meeting and collective fundraising effort. So I rearranged my afternoon schedule and drove to my parents' house, expecting to participate in familiar discussions about payment plans, family contributions, and George's promises to seek help for his gambling problem once this latest crisis was resolved. But when I arrived at the house, I found Linda sitting alone at the kitchen table with a stack of bank statements and a laptop computer, looking more serious and determined than I had ever seen her during previous discussions about George's financial problems. The absence of other family members was unusual, since George's bailout meetings typically involved everyone who might be asked to contribute money or emotional support for whatever solution the family developed. "Where is everyone?" I asked as I sat down across from Linda, noticing that the bank statements on the table appeared to be from accounts that I didn't recognize. "Aren't we having a family meeting about George's latest gambling debts? This situation is beyond what we usually deal with," Linda replied, her voice carefully controlled in a way that suggested she had rehearsed this conversation. "George owes $1.3 million to some very serious people who are not willing to wait for payment plans or accept partial payments. They want the full amount within 48 hours, or there will be consequences that could affect his physical safety and possibly involve other family members." The amount was staggering. $1.3 million represented George's largest gambling debt ever and exceeded the combined total of all his previous losses that the family had covered over the years. It was also, I realized with growing unease, exactly the amount I had saved for my wedding, though I told myself that this was just an unfortunate coincidence, and that Linda was calling this meeting to discuss how the extended family might contribute to a bailout of this magnitude. "How did George accumulate $1.3 million in gambling debts?" I asked, trying to understand how someone with no steady income and a history of financial irresponsibility could have accessed credit in such enormous amounts. What casino or creditor would extend that kind of credit to someone with George's financial history? "These aren't traditional casinos or legitimate creditors," Linda explained, her voice becoming more tense as she described George's involvement with underground poker games and high-stakes gambling operations that functioned outside normal regulatory oversight. "George got involved with some private gambling clubs in San Francisco that cater to wealthy clients and don't require the same credit checks or financial documentation that legal casinos use. The people who run these operations have their own methods for ensuring payment, and they're not subject to the consumer protection laws that limit what legitimate businesses can do to collect debts." The description of George's creditors was terrifying, and helped explain why Linda seemed more frightened than usual during discussions about his financial problems. Previous bailouts had involved credit card companies, traditional lenders, or small-time creditors who used legal collection methods. But George had apparently escalated to gambling venues that employed enforcement methods more associated with organized crime than legitimate business operations. "So, what's the family plan for handling this?" I asked, assuming that Linda was about to outline a strategy for raising $1.3 million through contributions from everyone who could afford to help, possibly involving business loans, home equity lines of credit, or liquidation of investments that various family members had accumulated over the years. But Linda's response was not a request for contribution or a discussion of fundraising strategies. It was a matter-of-fact announcement that she had already solved George's problem by accessing money that she claimed was available for family emergencies and urgent situations that required immediate action without the delay of family meetings or collective decision-making processes. "I've already handled it," Linda said, her voice taking on a defiant tone that suggested she expected disagreement with her unilateral decision. "I had access to your wedding fund as the emergency contact on the account, and I transferred the entire $1.3 million to cover George's debt. The creditors have been paid, George is safe, and the family crisis has been resolved." The words hit me like a physical blow, as I realized that Linda had not only stolen my entire wedding fund without permission or discussion, but had done so with apparent conviction that this represented appropriate family financial management, rather than theft of money that belonged to me and had been saved for my own purposes over many years of sacrifice and careful planning. "You stole my wedding money?" I asked, my voice reflecting the shock and disbelief I was experiencing as I tried to process that my mother had emptied my savings account to pay my uncle's gambling debts. "You took $1.3 million that I saved for my wedding and gave it to George." "I didn't steal anything," Linda replied defensively, apparently having prepared justifications for her actions that positioned the theft as legitimate family financial management. "That money was sitting in a savings account, earning minimal interest while George was facing a genuine life-threatening emergency. I made an executive decision to redirect family resources from a non-essential expense to a critical family crisis that required immediate intervention." The characterization of my wedding as a non-essential expense, while George's gambling debts were described as a critical family crisis, revealed the fundamental dysfunction in our family's value system, and Linda's complete inability to distinguish between legitimate needs and consequences that should be allowed to occur naturally when someone makes destructive choices repeatedly over many years. "That money belonged to me," I said, my voice rising as I began to understand the magnitude of what Linda had done. "I earned every dollar of that wedding fund through my own business, and you had no right to take it for any purpose, regardless of George's problems or your opinions about how I should spend my money." But Linda was unmoved by my objections and continued to defend her actions as necessary family intervention that prioritized George's safety over my wedding preferences, as if the two were equivalent concerns that required balancing, rather than recognizing that George's gambling debts were self-created problems, while my wedding was a legitimate personal goal, funded through my own earnings and hard work. The conversation that followed was the most devastating discussion I had ever had with a family member, as Linda systematically dismissed my wedding dreams as just a party, minimized the theft of my life savings as temporary reallocation of family resources, and suggested that I should be grateful that George's life had been saved rather than complaining about losing money that I could easily replace given my business success. "You make plenty of money with your app business," Linda said, apparently believing that my ability to earn income justified stealing my savings for other people's problems. "You can save up for another wedding, but George can't get another life if these creditors had decided to harm him. Sometimes family members have to make sacrifices for each other, and this was your turn to help when help was desperately needed." The suggestion that being robbed of my wedding fund was my turn to help revealed Linda's fundamental misunderstanding of family relationships, mutual support, and the difference between voluntary assistance and theft of other people's property for purposes they haven't agreed to support. But the most devastating aspect of Linda's theft wasn't just the loss of my wedding fund. It was the realization that my own mother viewed my success as a family asset that could be appropriated for other people's problems without my consent, discussion, or even notification, until after the money was already gone and the situation was irreversible. Have you ever discovered that your parents view your hard-earned success as their emergency fund, to be accessed whenever other family members create crises that require expensive solutions? That's exactly what I learned when Linda calmly explained that she had stolen my entire wedding fund, as if this represented reasonable family financial planning, rather than criminal theft that had destroyed months of careful preparation for the most important day of my life. The immediate practical consequences of Linda's theft were overwhelming and humiliating in ways that extended far beyond the obvious financial loss, requiring me to make dozens of devastating phone calls to vendors, venue coordinators, caterers, photographers, musicians, and florists to cancel elaborate arrangements that had been planned for months and would result in substantial cancellation fees, lost deposits, and professional embarrassment for everyone involved in creating what was supposed to be my dream wedding. The first call was to the vineyard where our rehearsal dinner was scheduled to take place, a family-owned winery in Napa Valley that had reserved their private dining room and arranged for a custom menu featuring locally sourced ingredients paired with specially selected wines from their reserve collection. The vineyard manager, Maria Santos, was shocked to learn that I was canceling just 3 weeks before the event and expressed genuine concern about what kind of emergency could require such a drastic change to long-standing plans. "Ms. Campbell, I'm so sorry to hear about your cancellation," Maria said, her voice filled with professional sympathy and personal disappointment. "Your rehearsal dinner was going to be one of our most elegant events this season, and we've been looking forward to hosting your celebration. I hope everything is okay with your family, and that whatever emergency has occurred can be resolved without too much stress." The irony of Maria's concern about my family emergency was particularly painful, since the emergency that had destroyed my wedding was entirely created by my family's decision to prioritize my uncle's gambling addiction over my legitimate personal goals and carefully planned celebration. But I couldn't bring myself to explain the real reason for the cancellation, so I provided vague references to unexpected family circumstances that had made it impossible to proceed with our original plans. The cancellation fees for the vineyard reservation were substantial, but not unexpected: $15,000 for the lost food preparation, wine selection, and staff scheduling that couldn't be reassigned to other events on such short notice. The Botanical Garden venue required an additional $25,000 cancellation fee for the ceremony space, floral installations, and coordination services that had been reserved exclusively for our use. The reception venue, catering company, string quartet, and photographer each imposed their own penalties for late cancellation, bringing the total cost of Linda's theft to over $1.4 million when cancellation fees were included with the original wedding fund that had been stolen. But the financial losses were secondary to the emotional devastation of calling 200 guests to explain that the wedding they had been invited to celebrate was no longer happening due to unforeseen circumstances that I couldn't describe honestly without revealing the embarrassing truth about my family's financial dysfunction and criminal behavior. "Audrey, what happened?" asked my college roommate Jessica when I called to uninvite her from what was supposed to be the celebration of my marriage to Marcus. "Is everything okay with you and Marcus? Are you having second thoughts about the wedding?" The assumption that my cancellation was related to relationship problems with Marcus was understandable, but added another layer of humiliation to an already devastating situation. I found myself in the impossible position of trying to explain that our relationship was strong and our commitment to marriage unchanged, while simultaneously acknowledging that the wedding we had planned was impossible due to circumstances I couldn't fully explain without destroying what remained of my family relationships. Marcus, who had been equally shocked to learn about Linda's theft, was supportive and understanding about the cancellation, but clearly struggling to process the magnitude of my family's betrayal and the implications for our future relationships with people who had demonstrated such disregard for our happiness and financial autonomy. "I can't believe your mother stole our entire wedding fund," Marcus said during one of our late-night conversations about how to move forward after such a devastating betrayal. "And I can't understand how she could think that paying George's gambling debts was more important than respecting your savings and our wedding plans. This is theft, not family financial management." Marcus's perspective as someone outside the Campbell family dynamics provided clarity about Linda's behavior that I had been unable to achieve due to years of conditioning that normalized George's financial crises and the family's enabling responses to his gambling addiction. From Marcus's viewpoint, Linda had committed a serious crime that warranted criminal prosecution rather than family discussion and private resolution. But the most painful aspect of the wedding cancellation was learning how my extended family reacted to news of Linda's theft and the destruction of my wedding plans. Instead of expressing outrage about the unauthorized appropriation of my savings or sympathy for the loss of my carefully planned celebration, most family members seemed to support Linda's decision and suggested that I was overreacting to what they characterized as temporary inconvenience, rather than recognizing it as criminal theft that had destroyed months of planning and dreams. "Weddings are just parties anyway," my Aunt Carol said when she learned about the cancellation, apparently echoing Linda's justification for stealing my wedding fund. "The important thing is that George is safe and the family stuck together during a crisis. You and Marcus can always have a simple ceremony later, when emotions have settled down and everyone has had time to process what happened." The casual dismissal of my wedding as just a party, while treating George's gambling debts as a legitimate family crisis, revealed how completely the Campbell family had internalized the dysfunction that positioned George's addiction as everyone else's responsibility, rather than recognizing it as his personal problem that required professional treatment and natural consequences for destructive choices. But what really shocked me was discovering that Linda's theft had been planned and coordinated with other family members who had encouraged her to access my wedding fund, rather than allowing George to face bankruptcy, creditor harassment, or whatever other consequences might have resulted from his latest round of gambling losses. We talked about it as a family and decided that someone needed to take action before George got hurt, my Uncle David admitted when I confronted him about his knowledge of Linda's theft. "You have a successful business that generates plenty of money, and you could always save up for another wedding." But George was facing immediate danger from people who don't accept excuses or payment plans. The revelation that my theft had been a coordinated family decision rather than Linda's independent choice was even more devastating than learning about the original crime, because it meant that multiple relatives had participated in planning to steal my wedding fund while pretending to support my wedding preparations and acting as if they cared about my happiness and success. "You all planned this together?" I asked David, trying to understand how many family members had been involved in plotting to steal my life savings. "How long have you been planning to take my wedding money for George's gambling debts?" "It wasn't like that," David replied defensively, apparently realizing that his admission had revealed the premeditated nature of the theft. "We were just trying to be prepared in case George's situation became desperate, and when it did, we had to act quickly to protect him. We always intended to help you save up for another wedding once things settled down with George's problems." But David's explanation only confirmed that the family had been viewing my wedding fund as available resources for George's benefit, rather than respecting it as my personal savings for my own purposes, and that they had been making contingency plans to steal my money while pretending to support my wedding preparations and celebrate my engagement. The sense of betrayal was complete and irreversible. Not only had Linda stolen my wedding fund, but she had done so with the knowledge and support of family members who had been pretending to care about my happiness while secretly planning to sacrifice my dreams for George's gambling addiction. As I sat in my empty apartment that night, surrounded by wedding planning materials and vendor contracts that were now meaningless pieces of paper, I made a decision that would change my relationship with the Campbell family forever. I was going to stop being their compliant ATM machine and start holding them accountable for their crimes, their enabling behavior, and their systematic exploitation of my success for George's benefit. The decision to pursue criminal charges against Linda and hold the entire family accountable for their coordinated theft was both emotionally difficult and strategically necessary, since I realized that private resolution or family intervention would only enable continued exploitation while teaching them that stealing from successful relatives was an acceptable strategy for managing George's gambling addiction and its financial consequences. My first call was to criminal defense attorney Sarah Mitchell, who specialized in white-collar crimes and had experience with family financial disputes that escalated beyond civil matters into criminal prosecution territory. Sarah listened carefully as I described Linda's theft, the family coordination involved in planning and executing the crime, and the broader pattern of financial exploitation that had characterized my relationship with relatives who viewed my business success as a resource for their own benefit. "This is clearly criminal theft, regardless of family relationships or claimed emergency circumstances," Sarah explained during our initial consultation. "Your mother had no legal authority to access your personal savings account for any purpose, and the fact that she used the money to pay someone else's debts makes this a straightforward case of larceny and financial fraud that prosecutors will take seriously." The legal analysis was both validating and sobering, as it confirmed that Linda's actions constituted serious crimes, while also highlighting the likelihood that criminal prosecution would permanently destroy my relationships with family members who had supported or enabled her theft of my wedding fund. "Are you prepared for the family consequences of pressing criminal charges?" Sarah asked, clearly understanding that prosecuting relatives creates emotional complications that extend beyond legal proceedings. Once you file charges against your mother and potentially other family members who participated in planning this theft, there's no going back to normal family relationships or private resolution of these conflicts. The question forced me to confront the reality that holding Linda accountable for her crimes would likely mean permanent estrangement from family members who preferred enabling George's addiction to respecting my financial autonomy and personal boundaries. But I had already lost my wedding, my savings, and my trust in people who claimed to love me while stealing from me. So the prospect of losing relationships built on exploitation and disrespect seemed like an acceptable trade-off for justice and protection from future theft. "I understand that pressing charges will end my relationships with people who think stealing from me was acceptable," I replied. "But those relationships were already destroyed when they decided that George's gambling debts were more important than my wedding dreams and my right to control my own money." Sarah nodded approvingly at my response and began outlining the legal strategy that would not only pursue criminal charges against Linda, but also involve civil litigation to recover the stolen funds, legal fees, and additional damages related to the cancellation costs and financial losses that resulted from her theft. "We'll file criminal charges for grand larceny and financial fraud," Sarah explained, "and we'll pursue civil action for recovery of the stolen funds plus punitive damages that reflect the premeditated nature of the theft and the family coordination involved in planning and executing the crime." But Sarah also recommended that I document the broader pattern of financial exploitation that had characterized my relationship with the Campbell family, since establishing a history of similar behavior would strengthen both the criminal case and civil litigation while potentially revealing additional crimes or civil violations that could increase the penalties and recovery amounts. "I want you to create a comprehensive record of every time you've provided money to George or other family members, every instance where you were pressured to contribute to bailout funds, and every occasion where family members suggested that your financial success created obligations to support other people's problems," Sarah instructed. "This pattern of exploitation will be crucial for demonstrating that the wedding fund theft wasn't an isolated incident, but part of systematic financial abuse that you've been subjected to for years." The documentation process was emotionally exhausting but professionally illuminating, as I compiled records showing that I had provided over $200,000 to George's various gambling-related bailout funds during the previous 5 years, while receiving constant pressure to contribute more money whenever his latest financial crisis exceeded the family's ability to handle through other means. The spreadsheet I created showing 5 years of financial exploitation was shocking even to me, as it revealed that my contributions to George's gambling addiction had exceeded the annual salaries of most working professionals, while simultaneously being treated as insufficient evidence of my family loyalty or concern for George's well-being. "You've been victimized by systematic financial abuse disguised as family obligation," Sarah observed when she reviewed my documentation. "The amounts you've contributed to your uncle's gambling debts, combined with the emotional manipulation used to pressure you into continuing these contributions, constitute a clear pattern of exploitation that will strengthen our case significantly." But the documentation also revealed that Linda's theft was not an impulsive decision made during a family emergency, but rather the culmination of years of viewing my success as a family resource that could be accessed whenever George's gambling created financial crises that exceeded other relatives' ability or willingness to provide bailout funding. The criminal charges against Linda were filed 3 weeks after my canceled wedding date, on what would have been my honeymoon in Italy with Marcus. Instead of celebrating our marriage in Tuscany, I was meeting with prosecutors to provide evidence for charges including grand larceny, financial fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit theft that could result in significant prison time if Linda was convicted on all counts. "The evidence in this case is overwhelming," Prosecutor David Rodriguez explained during our meeting to discuss the charges and potential plea negotiations. "We have bank records showing unauthorized access to the victim's account, documentation of the coordinated planning involved in the theft, and clear evidence that the stolen funds were used for purposes that had nothing to do with any legitimate emergency involving the victim. The prosecutor's confidence about securing conviction was encouraging, but the reality of pursuing criminal charges against my mother was emotionally complicated in ways that I hadn't fully anticipated. Despite Linda's betrayal and theft, she was still the person who had raised me, supported my education, and celebrated my business success before deciding that my achievements should be exploited for George's benefit. But the emotional complexity was balanced by recognition that Linda's theft represented such a fundamental violation of trust and respect that allowing her to escape consequences would only enable continued exploitation, while teaching the entire family that stealing from successful relatives was an acceptable strategy for managing George's gambling addiction. The media attention that resulted from criminal charges against Linda was unexpected, but ultimately beneficial for raising awareness about family financial abuse and the ways that successful individuals can be exploited by relatives who view their achievements as resources to be appropriated for other people's problems rather than respected as personal accomplishments. The story was initially covered by local business publications interested in the intersection of entrepreneurial success and family dysfunction, but it gained broader attention when several prominent tech industry leaders shared their own experiences with family members who had attempted to exploit their professional achievements for personal benefit. Family financial abuse is more common than people realize, posted venture capitalist Jennifer Kim on LinkedIn. And Audrey Campbell's courage in exposing this theft will help other successful individuals recognize when their own families are exploiting their achievements rather than celebrating them. The social media support from business leaders and entrepreneurs was both personally validating and professionally beneficial, as it connected me with a network of people who understood the challenges of maintaining family relationships while protecting personal financial autonomy from relatives who might view success as an obligation to fund their problems and poor decisions. But the most important outcome of the media attention was the message it sent to the Campbell family about the consequences of their coordinated theft and systematic exploitation of my business success for George's gambling addiction. The immediate impact of criminal charges and media attention on my family was swift, comprehensive, and devastating in ways that forced them to confront the reality that their enabling behavior and financial exploitation had been exposed to public scrutiny and legal accountability that would create lasting consequences for everyone involved in Linda's theft of my wedding fund. George's reaction to learning that his gambling debts had been paid with money stolen from my wedding fund was telling in its complete absence of remorse or recognition that his addiction had once again caused devastating harm to family members who had been trying to support his recovery through financial sacrifice and emotional accommodation. "I didn't know the money came from Audrey's wedding fund," George claimed when reporters contacted him about the criminal charges against Linda, "and I would never have accepted help if I had known it would interfere with her wedding plans. I thought the family had raised the money through other means." But George's claim of ignorance was contradicted by family members who revealed that he had been present during discussions about accessing my wedding fund and had actively supported Linda's plan to steal the money, rather than allowing him to face bankruptcy or other natural consequences of his gambling addiction. George knew exactly where the money was coming from, my cousin Jennifer told investigators. And he said that Audrey could always have another wedding, but he couldn't get another life if the creditors decided to hurt him. He was completely supportive of taking her money. The revelation that George had not only known about the theft, but had actively supported it, destroyed any sympathy I might have felt for his situation, and confirmed that his gambling addiction had progressed to the point where he was willing to steal from family members rather than seek professional treatment or accept responsibility for the consequences of his destructive choices. But George's problems extended beyond the immediate family drama, as his gambling creditors were apparently not satisfied with the payment they had received and were pursuing additional collections related to interest, penalties, and other charges that had accumulated during the period when George's debt was outstanding. The people George owes money to are saying that the $1.3 million payment was just the principal amount, Linda revealed during one of our few conversations before her arrest, and they're demanding additional payments for interest and late fees that could exceed another $500,000. The revelation that George's debt was larger than the amount Linda had stolen, was both predictable and infuriating, since it confirmed that the family's bailout strategy was not only morally wrong, but also financially inadequate to solve the underlying problem of George's gambling addiction and its escalating financial consequences. Meanwhile, Linda was discovering that criminal charges for financial theft create consequences that extend far beyond potential prison time, affecting employment opportunities, social relationships, and community standing in ways that couldn't be resolved through plea negotiations or family reconciliation. Your mother has been terminated from her position at the real estate agency, her former employer informed me when I called to discuss the impact of criminal charges on Linda's professional situation. We can't employ someone who is facing charges for financial theft, regardless of the personal circumstances that might have motivated her actions. The employment consequences were followed by social isolation as friends and community members learned about Linda's theft and began questioning their own relationships with someone who had demonstrated such disregard for her daughter's financial autonomy and personal goals. "People are treating me like a criminal," Linda complained during one of our final conversations before plea negotiations began, "and they don't understand that I was trying to save George's life during a genuine family emergency." But Linda's continued characterization of George's gambling debts as a family emergency, rather than recognizing them as natural consequences of his addiction, revealed that she still didn't understand why stealing my wedding fund had been inappropriate and criminal, rather than reasonable family financial management. The extended family members who had supported or encouraged Linda's theft were also discovering that their involvement in coordinated criminal activity created legal liability and social consequences that they hadn't anticipated when they were planning to solve George's problems by stealing my money. "We're being investigated as co-conspirators," my Uncle David admitted when prosecutors began examining the family coordination involved in planning and executing the theft. "Our lawyers are saying we could face criminal charges for conspiracy and aiding and abetting if prosecutors decide to pursue everyone who was involved in planning this. The legal jeopardy faced by family members who had supported the theft was appropriate and necessary for ensuring that the full scope of criminal activity was addressed through prosecution, rather than allowing some participants to escape consequences, while others faced the full weight of legal accountability." But the most satisfying development was learning that George's reputation and employability had been completely destroyed by media coverage of his gambling addiction and the family financial abuse that had been employed to enable his destructive behavior. "No one will hire someone whose gambling debts resulted in family members being arrested for theft," a former colleague explained when George contacted him about potential employment opportunities. "Your addiction has created too much drama and legal liability for any responsible employer to consider you as a viable candidate." The professional consequences for George were exactly what should have happened years earlier, if the family had allowed natural consequences to occur instead of enabling his addiction through repeated bailouts funded by theft from successful relatives who were trying to build their own lives and achieve their own goals. The resolution of criminal charges and civil litigation took nearly 2 years to complete, but the final outcomes provided both justice for the theft of my wedding fund and meaningful consequences for family members who had participated in systematic financial exploitation disguised as family loyalty and emergency intervention. Linda ultimately accepted a plea agreement that included 18 months in minimum security prison, 5 years of probation, complete restitution of the stolen $1, $3 million plus interest and damages, and participation in financial counseling programs designed to address the underlying attitudes that had led to her criminal behavior. "Your mother will serve her full sentence without possibility of early release," Prosecutor David Rodriguez explained during our final meeting about the criminal case, "and she'll be required to make complete restitution, plus additional penalties that reflect the premeditated nature of the theft and the family coordination involved in planning the crime." The civil litigation against family members who had participated in planning or supporting the theft resulted in additional financial recovery that covered my wedding cancellation costs, legal fees, and punitive damages that reflected the systematic nature of financial exploitation I had experienced over many years. But beyond the legal vindication and financial recovery, The most important outcome was the opportunity to use my experience to raise awareness about family financial abuse and help other successful individuals recognize when their own relatives are exploiting their achievements rather than celebrating them. The nonprofit organization I established, Financial Autonomy Foundation, provides legal resources, emotional support, and educational materials for people whose families are attempting to exploit their success through theft, manipulation, or inappropriate pressure to fund other people's problems and poor decisions. Your story has helped hundreds of people recognize financial abuse in their own families, Foundation board member Dr. Lisa Chen observed during our first annual meeting. And the legal resources we provide have prevented millions of dollars in family theft that might have occurred without education about boundaries and consequences. The Foundation's work has been particularly meaningful for entrepreneurs and professionals whose business success creates expectations from family members who view their achievements as resources to be shared rather than personal accomplishments that deserve respect and protection. But the most personally satisfying development was the wedding that Marcus and I eventually celebrated, funded by supportive business contacts and friends who wanted to help us achieve the celebration we had originally planned before Linda's theft destroyed our initial preparations. This wedding is more meaningful than our original plans would have been, Marcus observed during our actual wedding reception, because it's being celebrated by people who respect your achievements and support your happiness rather than people who view your success as their entitlement. The wedding we ultimately had was smaller than originally planned but more authentic, surrounded by people who had demonstrated genuine loyalty during the difficult period when my family's betrayal was being resolved through criminal prosecution and civil litigation. The final lesson from my experience with family financial theft and systematic exploitation is that enabling addiction by stealing from responsible family members doesn't solve the underlying problem. It creates new victims while perpetuating destructive cycles that harm everyone involved. George's gambling addiction was never addressed through professional treatment or personal accountability, and the family's strategy of funding his debts through theft only delayed inevitable consequences, while teaching him that his destructive behavior would always be subsidized by relatives who could be manipulated into providing financial rescue. Families that enable addiction by stealing from successful members are destroying everyone involved. Addiction counselor Dr. Michael Torres explained during one of our foundation's educational seminars, the addict doesn't recover because they never face natural consequences. The successful family members become victims of systematic exploitation, and the enabling family members become criminals who sacrifice their own integrity to perpetuate destructive behavior. If you're reading this and you're facing family pressure to fund other people's addictions, poor decisions, or financial crises through your own hard-earned success, please know that protecting your financial autonomy isn't selfish. It's necessary for maintaining healthy relationships and preventing the kind of exploitation that ultimately destroys families, rather than saving them. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for addicted family members is to let them face natural consequences for their choices, rather than enabling continued destructive behavior through financial rescue that prevents recovery and creates new victims in the process. Your success belongs to you, and family members who truly love you will celebrate your achievements rather than viewing them as resources to be exploited for other people's benefit. When families cross the line from requesting help to demanding sacrifice, from asking for support to committing theft, they've revealed that their love is conditional on your willingness to fund their problems, rather than being based on genuine care for your well-being and respect for your autonomy. If this story resonated with you, please hit that subscribe button and share your experiences in the comments below. Have you ever had family members steal from you to enable someone else's addiction or poor decisions? How did you handle relatives who viewed your success as their emergency fund? Your story might help someone else who's dealing with family financial exploitation and needs to understand that protecting their achievements isn't selfish. It's necessary for preventing systematic abuse that destroys everyone involved. Thank you for joining me on this journey. And remember that true family celebrates your success rather than exploiting it. And sometimes the only way to save your family from destructive enabling is to stop participating in it yourself. See you in our next story here on Her Sweet Revenge.